the working people of Russia independently, feeling the subjugation of the Tsar, while also independent of Lenin or the Bolshevik Party, were independently organizing these movements. And you can read about it. There were uprisings of the sailors and soldiers and navy occurring long before this because they were against what the Tsar was doing. And in that environment, there were many parties, left-wing parties, right-wing parties, who were having all sorts of discourses on how to deal with the Tsar. Most of them wanted to work with the Tsar. They said, oh, he's a nice guy. Let's work with him, because they wanted to suppress the mass of workers there. Out of that arose the Bolshevik Party, which was a very minority party. And that party led workers to a successful revolution against the Tsar, 1917. And if you look at the events of 1917 during 1919, massive changes took place within Russia. Now think about this. Russia puts up Sputnik in literally 33 years from that moment, 1950s. How did that happen? How does a country go from feudalism to putting up something in space? Because they unleashed the large power of these working people who were absolutely suppressed. Lenin, to his credit, promised three things: land, peace, and bread, and he delivered on all three. And the day that the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, took place, and everyone needs to understand, this is the actual history, 19 countries tried to invade Russia. 19 countries. And these were the so-called white fascist white Russians who wanted to overthrow this emerging country where workers actually seized power, bottoms up. And the day that the Bolshevik Revolution took place, 125 organizations sprung up all over the world. They said, wow, working people are risen up in Russia, in the United States, in India, in France. If you read John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, it's a book called Reds. People may want to read it. Okay, John Reed was a journalist. So we need to go back and really look at that for what it was. Now, these 19 countries who tried to overthrow Russia were so scared that this concept of working people coming to power would spread to their countries, they had to choke it to death. And they were quite successful. They brutalized the Russian people. They surrounded Russia, right? And Stalin comes into power through that moment after Lenin's death. Stalin was not a theoretician, but imagine where you are in North Carolina. Imagine, Mel, that you had led a successful revolution for the people of South Carolina. Guess what? All the other governors of all the other 49 states are going to unite and try to overthrow you. And you're going to go into a wartime model, no different than in 1776, when after the American Revolution took place, the British tried to overthrow it. There's only one country which burned down the White House. It was Britain.
Right.
So the counter-revolution was quite severe in Russia. And that led to a wartime model, which Stalin comes into power. So it was a reaction to what took place. And so this needs to be clearly, so all these idiot Nazi Zionists, oh my God, the Bolsheviks killed, there's no data on this. They're just making it up because they want to equate working people's movements to Nazism. And I know this because there were a number of professors in the late 70s and 80s who were invited to meetings where they were told they would be fired or kept in their departments unless they started to perpetuate this lie. And one professor got up and they said, can you show me the data that the Russians, that these people killed 20 million people? He goes, we're just going to say it. So that's what's going on. The ultimate goal of the swarm is to make sure we, particularly in America, the working people of America never recognize their noble history of building these bottoms-up movements. There's been a massive rewriting of history. And that's why right now is very dangerous, because Zionism and Nazism were the forces that the swarm unleashed to justify that it's okay for a czar, it's okay for a bunch of priests or Brahmins or a bunch of small set of people to rule over us. And this is at the heart of it. So they may have their differences, the swarm, minor differences. One says east, one says west, one may like chocolate, one may like tiramisu, but at the end of the day, they are united to make sure we as working people never organize and unite around real leaders. So that's where this is coming from. So Bolshevism, come on, you have to really go study it. They're just throwing shit against the wall.
To push back people who subscribe to Nazism or who don't view it as the great evil that it's been, they would say the same thing, that This is, all about some contentions with historical facts about the Holocaust that people have. I know nobody wants to talk about that, but it is what it is. And so I think that a lot of people would push back and say, because there was this just massive demonization of working class Germans, who again were part of the Nazi Party.
Let's just stop right there. This is what actually happened in Germany. Unfortunately, what's happened is the propaganda machine in the United States just says stuff, and they do it through academia. This is what fundamentally happened. In the early 1900s, there was, again, this growing workers' movement in Russia. The leaders of those movements were Jews, working class Jews, and Germans. And when Hitler was rising up, these Jewish trade unionist leaders and Germans basically said, wait a minute. And there was this very small group called Zionists, a very small emerging group done by Theodor Herzl. And the Zionists were seen as a fringe party who everyone hated, actually. However, what took place was that Hitler effectively used them. The first people that Hitler butchered were trade union leaders, and those Jews. That's who we went after, supported by US and British imperialism, because the United States and Britain did not want to see a major revolution take place in Germany, because then you would spread to the United States. This is what their concern was. Again, growing back to the fact in the late 1800s and early 1900s, America was on the verge of revolution, massive revolution, which has been wiped out of American history. So the Jews of that era were like, wait a minute, we're not going to go to some place called Argentina or Uganda. This idiot Herzl, who was, by the way, an atheist, was promoting the concept, oh, we're being oppressed here. Let's go over here. His number one choice was actually Uganda and Argentina, and actually parts of Texas, even Mississippi, but Uganda and Argentina. And he had unearthed some old stuff saying those were the Holy Land. The British said, no, we're going to place you here. But the bottom line is that the Jews knew that they were Europeans, no different than the blacks who'd been here for 400 years, knew that they were, at this point, they were in America. And you can relate it to Marcus Garvey in the 1800s, who said, oh, blacks are being mistreated here. Let's all go back to Africa. And he actually went and got some ships to ship people back. But the large majority of blacks viewed themselves as Americans, and we're going to fight here. This is our land. We're going to fight for our rights. One was cultural nationalism. The other was progressive nationalism. Same thing in Germany. People like Herzl were telling European Jews, who were actually Europeans, to say, oh, let's go to some other land. And Jews were like, no, this is our land. We're going to fight for our rights here. And that's what had to be demolished. So the more anti-Semitism they suffered, the more the Zionist movement grew. And that's what actually took place. The Zionists collaborated with the Nazis. They crushed the workers' movement in Germany. We need to build a bottoms-up movement. Go to shivaforpresident.com and volunteer.